like to introduce you to Jamie McGrath Morris, with whom I had a delightful couple of hours this morning. He is writing a biography of Anne's father, Tony Hillerman. So as part of our discussion this morning, we recorded a podcast, which Miles either has or will put up on our website, where it says podcast if you're there. And you can listen to it. But do you want to say a few words to them about your project?
I'll keep a very few words because this is our center of attention tonight. But what Anne is carrying on is a very significant tradition and something very important. We were talking today about what was one of Tony Hillerman's great achievements, and what it was taking the traditional detective novel and setting it into a new culture with a new set of people. And one of the points I made to my publisher when I approached them about this idea is that Tony Hillerman's greatest achievement in life may not have been the books he wrote, but the way he introduced the world to Navajos through his books. And in France and in Italy and in Norway, people know about our Navajo culture because of that. And I think it's an enormously significant event. And I'll just tell you the little thing I told you today. I had dinner with a trained PhD anthropologist in Washington, D.C. When I was starting this project, and we're friends, and she told me that something about the Navajo's way of death, and I said, how do you know that? Expecting her to say, Dr. Schmickelbayer's definitive paper on the subject, and she leaned back in her chair and said, Hillerman.
Real walk down memory lane for me this morning because, due to my advanced age, I read Tony in real time. I remember when The Blessing Way published, which Jamie was like, or Anne, 1971?
1970.
1970. Robert Barker wrote his first Spencer book a little bit later, so Tony actually had the edge. And experiencing, when I first came to Scottsdale in 1950, the city was unincorporated, there were 2 paved roads. You flew into Terminal 1, it was a buckboard to the Camelback Inn, and it was a day trip to Taliesin West. I kid you not.
Oh my God.
And on all of that, up until 30 years later, when I read The Blessing Way, while I came to Phoenix on a regular basis from Chicago, I knew absolutely nothing about the Navajo and the very significant culture and landholding that they have here. So Tony opened my eyes to an aspect of Arizona that I had been completely oblivious to up until that point. And it was wonderful to read him in real time and to see the effect he had. He was not an overnight success. Believe me, it took a long time for those books to gain traction, right?
Yeah, it sure did. Is this on?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. So hi, so here you are. He having gained traction and now passing it to you. This is so exciting because this is actually the day before Anne's new book publishes, Cave of Bones. So you guys have a very special event tonight, and you might want to ask her to date your book because that gives it just a little bit of extra.
Well, I have to say thank you to you. When I really had no idea that I was going to be writing novels. I was doing some writing workshops in Santa Fe, and my dad was one of our presenters. He had retired from teaching at the university, but I could tell he was kind of missing that sort of interaction with people who wanted to know about writing and, just had questions for him. So he agreed to help us with these workshops. And one of our presenters was a guy whose books I see back here, Michael McGarity. And Michael was doing a talk about the role of landscape in his mysteries. And so my husband Don took a bunch of photos, and my dad was there in the audience. And afterwards he came up to us and he said, that was really a good idea. How come you guys never did anything like that for me? So Don and I put together a nonfiction book called Tony Hillerman's Landscape. And Barbara, even though, as you know, this is a mystery store, she invited Don and me to come and talk about that book. And at that point, the book came out a year and a day after my dad died. So I was still pretty much absorbed by grief of missing him. And after we did that talk, I said, would there be any questions? And so many people in this audience would say, so, when is the next Jim Chi Joe Leaphorn book coming? Did your dad have any more books in the pipeline? Was there something that HarperCollins could dust off and bring out? And I had to say no. And after this was, I think, the first event we did for that book. And then Don and I went around, we did a lot more events, and I always got those questions. So it was basically people like you who were so taken with my dad's stories that made me realize two things. First of all, that besides missing my dad, I was really missing Jim Chi and Joe Leaphorn and that whole wonderful world that Dad had created. And secondly, doing all those talks kind of gave me a little confidence. So I thought, well, maybe I'll try it. And the worst thing that happens is that I will show it to my mother and she'll say, oh, honey, why don't you go back to writing nonfiction? But luckily she didn't. And so now the fourth book in the reinvigorated series with Bernadette Manuelito will be out officially tomorrow, and unofficially you guys get a little preview.
It's so exciting. And for those of you who missed it, there is the new Tony Hillerman map. We sold hundreds of the old one, and now it's been updated to include Anne's 4 books and some of the spots that she's taken us to. So let's talk a little bit about the Malpais, which I think is fascinating. Last summer when we were together, Anne was researching, or maybe you were writing it at that point, but we drove through it at Christmas after our discussion so we could see it firsthand. It's a very interesting landscape.
It's fabulous. And one of the great things about following in my dad's tradition is that I don't have to make up everything. He set the tradition of writing about real landscapes on the Navajo Nation. So when I started writing the series, I thought I will continue this, but I'd like to take readers to other places that Dad hasn't written about so much. And he did have one scene in the Malpais, but my book uses that landscape a lot more. Anyway, the Malpais, it's a huge lava flow. If you're driving on I-40 from Albuquerque to, say, Gallup, you go through the edge of it. It's quite remarkable lava flow. It was formed by 4 different volcanoes, 75 lava vents. There's 2 main kinds of lava there, the Pahui lava and the lava. And I have to say, I love doing the research for this book. I learned so much about lava tubes and how the lava gets real thin on top of a bubble. So if you're walking out there, all of a sudden you're here and then you're here and you're in trouble. And there's special bats that live out there that were afflicted by a special bat fungus that was called the white nose disease. Anyway, it was a wonderful, I did all this research. I loved the Malpais. I thought this is perfect for a book. But then I realized my detective, Bernie Manuelito, was stationed far away in Shiprock. So I thought, so what could happen that would make it legitimate for Bernie to actually be solving a crime here? Well, luckily, since this was my first book, my fourth book, I had gotten to know Bernie, and I knew that she never minded doing a favor for people. So I created a scenario where somebody had done a favor for Bernie, now this gal needs a favor, so she calls Bernie, and unfortunately Bernie doesn't ask enough questions at the time, but it turns out the favor is something she would have really rather not done, but she's already committed, so she has to do it.
Right, which is a pretty sneaky way of accomplishing this. And there is a Navajo reservation right at the Malpais, and if you would like to drive it, and I can't recommend it highly, you can actually go up to Payson on the back road to Payson out of Fountain Hills, go east on 60, and I think it's at Quemada that you turn up north, and that road, I wrote about it in the e-news, those of you who get it, I gave you directions and so forth. And you go up north on that road, and at some point it forks, and one fork goes to Gallup, and the other fork goes to the Malpais. And it's absolutely gorgeous. You can drive through it and not stop, or you can take the time to do it. But as Anne's book will warn you, hiking in the Malpais is really not a great idea without some sort of assistance.
That's right. But there are a lot of maps, and it's maybe not quite as dangerous as it seems in my book. Although, one thing, when I started doing the research, I discovered that 2 people had disappeared out there, and they were found 7 years later, far away from where they were supposed to have been hiking. So that was another thing that encouraged me to use the Malpais as a setting. And there is a map in here. So if Barbara's directions aren't clear enough, you can put on your reading glasses and look it up on the map.
And it's also in the new map from Time Traveler as well, where you can see it. But
Oh, I wanted to say something. I was talking about fans. The whole reason that the book has a map was because I got an email from somebody, and she said, I love reading books about real places, but then I have to get out my map and find where they are. Why don't you ask your publisher to put in a map? I thought, good idea. So I just forwarded the email, thinking that would be the last of it. But no, they listened, and voila, there's a map. So that just goes to show it's worth sending authors you like emails with good suggestions.
So we know, if you've been reading them, that Joe Leaphorn has been sidelined since the first of Ian's books by an injury that he sustained. But he's making a great recovery, or at least a recovery, slow and steady, kind of like the tortoise. And of course, Jim is doing his thing, and Bernie does her thing. And she seems to respond very well to children. This is not the first book where Bernie has really gotten into her investigation because of teenagers, essentially.
Yeah.
So she's pretty young herself, right? And
Yeah.
there's a lot of sympathy with that.
Yeah, I think another thing, when I took over the series, I realized I had to build up some backstories for some of these characters and come up with some new characters. And so I thought Bernie, having a full-time job, having a new husband, being a woman in basically a male world, needed a few more, and being a Native American dealing with the major culture, needed a few more challenges. So I gave her this kind of ornery little sister, Darlene. So Darlene is kind of the inspiration and for all of these other sort of ornery kids that come into Bernie's life.
It'd be a really dull book if she were kind to her sleuths, right? I mean, where's the conflict if everybody's getting along and there's no... You can't build the whole thing just out of the investigation. There has to be some sort of challenges in her personal life as well. But you don't really want her and she to be, on the brink of divorce. So you've got to come up with other kinds of family challenges. I like her mother a lot.
Oh yeah, me too. Although she's kind of ornery, but I still like her. Well, people ask, was it easier to write the 4th book than it was to write the first books? And in a way it is, because I feel, first of all, I feel a little more confident that I will be able to go from page 1 to page 300 and get the darn thing done and solve the crime. And also because I know the characters a little better, having worked with them now for 8 years. But in a way it's not easier, because every book is like writing the first book. I mean, every book you have new characters, I have to figure out new ways to do people in, new ways to build suspense. So, I really try to make each book a little better than the one that came before it. So, the first, with Spider-Woman's Daughter, I love that book, but in a way I was just relieved to have kind of gotten to the end. But with Cave of Bones, I thought I was finished with it, and I set it aside. I thought, there's just something isn't quite right with this book. And I realized that I didn't have a high enough body count. So I had to kind of retrofit a whole new, I shouldn't tell you this, just pretend you never heard that word, retrofit. Anyway, Jim Chi didn't have enough to do, so I gave Jim Chi a little more to do, and I liked it a lot better, and I was really glad that I had the gift of having some extra time to let it sit and think about it before it went out into the real world.
I think you touched on a really important component of the books. At least one of the reasons I love them is that they are real places. Although occasionally you probably have to modify the real place in order for the exigencies of the plot. Like you can get there faster, or maybe you moved it just over here, or something of that.
Well, I try to not do that too much because of people with maps.
I used to do it. I talked to Jamie this morning, and Jamie reminded me that Tony would occasionally do that. You know, I mean, and then what did you say? He got letters from people who said you can't really drive there in 20 minutes. That's New Mexico. So maybe you're being, but he didn't have to face the map. You know, or GPS or
he didn't have Google Maps either.
Google Maps,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So you know, there we go.
But if it's a place where something bad happens, I do invent it because I don't want any real neighborhood on the reservation, any real community to kind of have that onus of having been written about in a book where there was a murder or something.
Right. And you did definitely inherit the legendary lieutenant.
I did.
You did.
I did.
Right. So I'm glad that he's making a recovery because I think it would have been hard if he'd just been, you know, there forever with his injury. But I'm glad he didn't make one of those, you know, sometimes in crime fiction, people are injured or terrible things happen to them, and then they're just like Teflon. And you get to the next book, and it's like none of that ever happened. So I'm really glad that, you know, that Joe, I'm sorry for Joe, obviously, but I'm glad that he is not, you know, just like it never happened.
Yeah, well, thanks. It seemed logical to me. My own husband has had some problems with strokes, which of course affect the brain. And I hate to say I've used his medical experience as research, but you know, just kind of watching him struggle, getting his language back, getting his memory back, really did help me writing about Joe and his brain injury. In the book I'm working on now, Joe Leeper is going to be the main crime solver. You know, it is fun. I'm really enjoying it. He's still having some language troubles, but his brain is sharp, and he's doing the job. And I'm enjoying working with him very, very much.
I'm so glad you're having a good time because I remember you were just like shredding up paper when we first talked about your doing this. You were so worried about it. Now I can see that you're just loving doing it and controlling everything, right? Do you have some passages that you would like to read to kind of illustrate various things in the book?
Well, I'm so glad you asked.
We didn't rehearse, we just read. And I couldn't help but notice the paper.
All right. Well, this is a scene from the very opening of the book, and I have to say, you know, they say writers should always read. You should read your work out loud, and then you can change it. And I did read it out loud, but as I've read it out loud more and more, I've kind of tuned it up. So this is not exactly the way you will find it in the book, but it's actually better. So yeah, this is from the very, and this was something new to me. This was writing a scene from the point of view of a character who wasn't one of my main characters. Annie Rainsong knew that today she would die, and that she deserved to. She should have never left her vision sight, but she was cold, restless, bored, hungry, and ready to be done with this outdoor stuff. She wanted a beer and a cigarette, or at least a shower and a sandwich. No, 2 sandwiches. She knew she should have been back at base camp by now. Leaving had been a bad, bad idea. The stupid piles of rocks that marked the trail blended into the darkness. Nothing looked familiar, or everything looked like something she'd seen before. Nothing looked safe. Her head ached, her feet hurt from the ugly new hiking boots. She wanted to stop moving. Her Shimisana had always told her not to complain, only to be grateful. She pictured her grandmother's face and remembered the warm smell of the blue corn cakes she fixed for breakfast. It made her feel like crying, so Annie swore out loud instead. She saw what looked like a cave up ahead and directed the weak beam of her flashlight into the lava. She would climb, she decided. Maybe she'd be lucky enough to fall asleep and die. She'd heard of that happening. She hiked toward it, relieved to have a destination, even though the blister on the back of her heel rubbed against the stiff boot every time she took a step. She felt less lost now. Maybe it would be warmer in there. Mr. Cruz and Mrs. Cooper had told her to stay out of caves because of hibernating bats, and because the caves might contain bones or gifts for the dead. She decided it didn't matter now. She was as good as dead anyway. The flashlight's beam reflected off the black rocks at the cave's mouth and illuminated wavy white lines and stick people. The figures made her think of something a little kid would draw, some light marks on the dark stone. Mrs. Cooper had mentioned they might see something like that and told the girls not to touch them. Annie ran her finger over a spiral. The image captured the moon's milky light. To get the flashlight inside the cave, she had to sink on her knees. The tremor in her hand made the faint light dance against the blackness. She inched toward the entrance, the light preceding her like bad news, finding no rats or rats' nests or anything that looked bear-like. She sat on the rock ledge, put down her flashlight, pulled up the collar on her jacket, and shoved her hands into her pockets. She wasn't even hungry or thirsty anymore, only bone cold and scared and ready to die. Maybe there was a bear in the very back of the cave where her light didn't go. Maybe it would find her and eat her and feed her to the cubs. That would be better than having her mom yell at her for being a screw-up. Better than having Mrs. Cooper tell her she'd ruined the whole trip for the group by not following the rules. Everyone cared about the rules. Nobody cared about her. But Annie Rainsong took pride in her toughness. Annie stretched out. Her right foot encountered something hard, probably a rock. She adjusted her position. She saw the sliver of the moon as it rose over the river of darkness separating the clouds. It was the time of year when some creatures would rest and others would die. Either way, she thought, this is how my story plays out. She must have closed her eyes, because when she opened them again, the sky wore a tinge of pink. She remembered where she was and why in the next millisecond. On the next breath, she realized that her back and hips hurt, her stomach ached, and December's cold had seeped up through the little bones of her smallest toes, all the way to her knees, her spine, and the very top of her head. Even her hair was freezing cold. She pushed herself to sitting and glanced down to see what her foot had pressed against in the dark night. Her screams echoed off the lava.
Whoa, so you introduced us. That was wonderful, by the way. You read that. It was real verb. You introduced that what we really are doing here is a kind of version of Outward Bound. No, seriously, for difficult children, or kids with problems, by taking them out there in the mountain ice and, setting them a challenge. The idea is to build their confidence and try to improve their general behavior, right?
Right. And it's interesting, as part of my writing process, I've been working with this guy who's a retired FBI agent. And he first came to New Mexico through a program called Cottonwood Gulch, which took kids, mostly kids from the east. They came on the train out to this camp that was in the Malpais. It was land that somebody, I think from St. Louis, had bought, but it was on the edge of the Rama Reservation, and a Rama family was very involved in setting up the camp and doing the cooking and teaching the kids arts and crafts and taking them out, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, my FBI guy is now on the board of this, of course. And so they're having an auction, so he says, gee, maybe you could donate some books and donate a photograph of your husband's, and why don't you come out? So when I went there, it was kind of the start, one of the ideas that eventually came into this book, because I was very impressed with sort of how primitive it was and how totally committed the people who ran it were to making things better for these kids. It's like not so much troubled kids like in this, but they do a lot of work with poor kids from Cibola and McKinley and the counties that are right around that part of New Mexico. And a lot of them are kids who are not outside. Both of their parents work, they spend their time watching TV, playing on their iPads, calling up things on their telephones. So I thought this is really a good program, and so from then it kind of morphed into Troubled Kids and what came out of Cave of Bones. People often ask writers, where do your ideas come from? And they just come from what's around you. So, yeah, I know my dad remember what my dad used to say about that?
No.
He would say, writers are like bag ladies. And they go through life with shopping carts. And you hear somebody who has an odd phrase, and you put that in your cart, and you see somebody with mixed mesh shoes, or you see somebody at a restaurant who's like reading the menu, with his magnifying glass. Anyway, all those little details of life you put in the shopping cart, and then when it comes time to write your book, you kind of go through there and throw out 90% of it, but you find a few little nuggets that then get in the books. And I thought that was pretty darn good.
I like it too, and I often thought that Jimmy's journalism experience, helped him figure out what those things were, to collect them and decide. And you too have written nonfiction, so perhaps that gives you an advantage when you move into fiction, that you know how to fill up that cart.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think also writing anything gives you respect for editors. And I think there are a lot of people who want to be writers, but when it comes down to it, they consider their words so totally precious that if someone says, well, if you cut out the first 20 pages of this book, it would be a lot better. Really, people could have said that to me on a lot of things I wrote. Anyway, they instead of thinking, oh yeah, this is a person who kind of knows the business, they think, what? Those are my precious words. I can't live without them. So I think my experience in journalism and writing nonfiction really helped when I switched to fiction, because I didn't view things I wrote as quite so precious.
True. I agree. I think that it is very helpful. Lawyers have been edited, journalists have been edited, and they, I think, have an easier time very often in writing novels to accept that. One of the problems is, I certainly have learned as an editor, it's really hard to know where the story begins. Sometimes you start a novel, and you realize like 20 or 30 pages later that that's really not where the story started. It was what you needed to tell yourself in order to get the story started, but then it's hard to let it go. Listen, you mentioned your husband's photographs. When Rob and I were in Santa Fe at Christmas, Ann and I gave a cocktail party for so many writers in Santa Fe. Man, if you throw a rock, you're going to kill a writer. It's amazing. But anyway, we gave a really wonderful.
At least bruising.
Right. Ann actually had it, and Rob catered it, so to speak. So it was a lot of fun. But at the same time, Ann's husband had an exhibition at the Santa Fe Library of his photos, which are gorgeous. And the book up front that Ann and John did together, Hillerman Country, has Don's photos in it. So if you've missed it, I can recommend that you look at it. But I think he's a wonderful photographer. How much fun for you?
Yeah,
And he was actually, a director of which museum?
He was the director of the Museum of Art.
The Museum of Art in
Yeah.
Santa Fe? Right,
Yeah.
so, there's a wonderful background there for
That was another advantage of journalism. I was the arts reporter for our local paper when Don came in to do that job. And I was not lucky in love, let me just say that. So I was thinking I should leave Santa Fe, because Santa Fe had a dearth of eligible young men. And then when Don came, I interviewed him, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll stay in Santa Fe. Just see what happens.
Isn't that wonderful?
It was. It is. 43 years.
Wow.
Right. What's your next scene that you want to read?
Oh, right.
Back to the task at
Back to
hand
the
here.
task.
Sorry, we keep wandering
Back
off
to
on
it.
byways.
Well, one of the subplots in this book involves Darlene, and Darlene has decided that she might want to go to art school, so she's at this wonderful real art school we have in Santa Fe called the Institute of American Indian Arts, on a special program for kids who maybe or maybe not are going to fit in there. And she is at a training in Santa Fe, so he tells Bernie that he will check up on her little sister. And this is after he has checked up on her, and he's getting ready to go back to his hotel. Chi walked back to his truck, shoving his hands in his pocket. Before opening the door to climb into the cab, he circled the vehicle, as was his habit. The rear tire on the passenger side was flat. He squatted down, using his flashlight to examine it, looking for a nail in the tread. No nail, but the cap was off the valve stem. It was no accident. Someone had jammed something in it to let the air escape. He straightened up and wiped his hands on his jeans, instantly creating a short list of suspects. If he'd been a man who swore, he would have had some choice words for the situation. He thought about changing the tire. No, he decided, he'd make the jerk who gave him that flat take care of it. Unlike Bernie, Chi didn't run as a regular pastime. He felt the exertion and the burning of his leg muscles and the challenge to his lungs as he headed for the studio. There were no vehicles on the road. The campus was quiet. Emergency lights and call stations glowed in the darkness to help a student who got in trouble. The jog worked off some of his anger. As he neared the studio building, he saw a car heading toward him. It moved more and more slowly as it approached. He was nearly across from it before he recognized the vehicle as Mrs. Lomas's vintage station wagon. She lowered the window and stopped. He stopped too. Officer Chi? Yes, ma'am. Do you need a ride? No, thank you. He bent at the waist, catching his breath. Why are you jogging? It's dark out here, you know. My truck has a flat tire, and I wanted to talk to the guys in the studio about that. I have AAA. I'll call somebody for you. They're awfully busy in there. Oh, they'll make time for me. Maybe that big guy in the studio can help you. The Navajo man? That's right. He looks strong to me. Chi was glad that, as usual, his service weapon was with him in its holster.
Yeah,
Can I read you one more?
Sure.
Okay.
It's your partner.
All right. Well, hey. So one thing people always want, when you write mysteries, people always say, so what's it about? And it's hard to say what's it about because really what you want people to do is to read it so they'll find out what it's about. But this book, partly it's about this young girl who gets lost in the lava. It's about, part of it involves a feisty Navajo counselor. There's some, possibly some financial corruption. There are some dueling mother-in-laws. There's a missing pickup truck. And because it's fiction, I was able to give New Mexico a real winter, which we have not had this year. So it also has a blizzard. So this is a scene, Bernie is out in the blizzard looking for a distraught gentleman who, they were having a meal and then he just drove off and she's worried about him. She used the snow-covered rock piles as guides, but his footprints didn't reappear. Either the blizzard had buried them, or he'd turned off the trail somewhere, and she'd missed the place. She called again, listened. The wind slackened, and her chilled bones rejoiced, but the only thing she heard was silence. She called again, and heard only the hush of the flakes landing on the pinon needles, sage, and lava rocks. Her face was numb now. Her toes barely responded when she tried to move them in her frozen boots. She couldn't risk becoming another job for the search team. Saying a silent prayer for the man, she turned back. She'd pay more attention to the sides of the trail now, looking for places he could have headed off into the lava. She had walked only a few minutes when she noticed faint depressions in the snow to the west. An animal? Maybe. She looked at the prints more closely, and then for landmarks to help her find the place to connect back to the parking lot trail. She spotted a lone tree that leaned to the right. Not much, but it would have to do. She remembered what he'd been wearing at the restaurant, a long-sleeved denim shirt and jeans under the jacket she'd seen abandoned in his truck. She felt chilled now, as warmly dressed as she was. He must be close to frozen. She called again, stepping in the indents that might be his tracks. Adrenaline energized her, and she forgot her cold feet and hands, focusing closely on the rapidly disappearing path she hoped the man had made. The deepening snow crept over the top of her hiking boots and sifted in to melt against her skin. The noise wasn't exactly like anything she'd heard before. At first, it sounded like an animal, maybe a rabbit or a fox. It stirred ancestral memories of shape-shifting creatures that roamed the earth at night, causing trouble. She stopped, her heart racing. It came again, and this time it was clearly human.
There you are. That'll drive anybody. I can see you really had a good time with this, right?
I did have a good time, and I got to go hiking out in the lava and looking for places where people could get lost and places where school groups could, where the group for the girls could assemble. It was great.
And even though there wasn't a blizzard, you can really be cold in Santa Fe at night. It's 7,000 and some feet, so even if you haven't had snow, it's pretty. We were there 2 years ago to do the Canyon Road Christmas walk. It was so cold, none of us could really manage it. This year, it was bearable to do it. So, it goes back and forth. So you've already told us that there will be a new book. Any update for you on any kind of television or movie treatment for Bernie?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking that question. I just, about 6 weeks ago, I signed an option. I'm the trustee of my dad's literary estate, so I signed an option for his stories and for my stories with Robert Redford and George R.R. Martin. Now, an option is just like a promise that maybe we'll get engaged someday. But still, it's better than nothing. So I've got my fingers crossed that maybe some movies or TVs or something will come from this.
That's so exciting.
Yeah.
We were walking out of a restaurant on Canyon Road, and a younger member of our party at Christmas said, "Oh, look, there's Robert Redford." It was actually very small. Hard to see him in the booth, and as you know, he's aged a lot. Nonetheless, he's spending a lot more time in Santa Fe. And George has created a really interesting thing in Santa Fe, the name of which I can't remember, but it's
Meow Wolf.
Thank you, Meow Wolf. I think it's fascinating. Tell them about it.
It's sort of an interactive, kind of like an art exhibit, kind of like a museum, kind of like a performing space, all rolled into one. It's hard to describe it. It's very experiential. But it's really wonderful, and the idea has done so well in New Mexico that now they are exporting it to Denver, and I think to Dallas. Yeah.
Very exciting. Well, anyway, since they're both there, there might be more commitment from George and Robert to do something with the film than if they were just sitting over there in Santa Monica thinking about things. And New Mexico, as we know from Longmire, from Craig Johnson's paragraphs here, is very actively encourages filming in New Mexico, which is why Longmire is not really in Wyoming, it's really in New Mexico. And C.J. Box was telling us about something he has signed, and I didn't ask him the other night, but I might have, whether those will also be filmed. This Wyoming will be filmed in Santa Fe, or whether it will be in Wyoming, so to speak. I don't know.
New Mexico is such a good stand-in for Wyoming. It seems like they should just do all Wyoming movies in New Mexico.
So far they are, but we'll see. You also mentioned Michael McGarty, and I had an email from him the other day saying he's written a new book, and it will be out this fall, so that's really exciting, back in the series, that he was doing.
Yeah, the Kevin Kearney.
Right, Kevin Kearney. And there's another author who writes about New Mexico, down in the Boot Heel, which I think are fabulous. Stephen Havel is his name, and he's written nearly 30 books that are set in that area. So New Mexico has really attracted an awful lot of writers to explore different aspects of its culture. Stephen's books are really much more about Hispanic culture because they're set on the border. And then your dad also inspired James Doss to write about the Utes, in Colorado, and Margaret Cole. I still remember Margaret Cole's very first public event ever. She sat next to your father, and she couldn't decide whether to just talk nonstop or shut up totally. She was so like, I'm next to Tony Hillerman. It was touch and go which way she was going to go. But she wrote 20 books. I think she just probably has stopped that series on the Wind River Reservation about the Arapaho. So your dad inspired other people to write about other Native American cultures, which was a big contribution too.
Well, after my dad died, one of my jobs was kind of getting rid of all of the things that he had accumulated. And in his office, he had a pile, probably as high as this chair, of manuscripts that people had sent him wanting endorsements for. And I probably should have mailed them all back, but I did not. I just disposed of them. But I think that was another way he really made an influence. And he was kind, but he also was very astute. And I think some of those manuscripts were probably still there because Dad didn't want to break somebody's heart by saying, I can't endorse this, so it was just kind of waiting till he was in the right mood, or not.
This sucks is not really what a writer wants to when I send them in, but your dad was very generous in doing that. There are a number of writers who have really go out of their way to help other writers. So, I think we've covered all my questions and your readings, so it looks like it would be time to see if there are questions from the audience. And before we do that, you're getting so good, you just I'm going to say thank you to our Facebook audience. We appreciate your joining us. She's backing up. Now, why do we do that? In part because if you leave the comments field on for Facebook, it's unbelievable the things that people write, and you have to monitor them. Oh. So we turned it off, and that makes them angry too. So our solution is we just turn it off. I mean, seriously, I had no idea how complicated it was. And then those people feel that their questions should take precedence over your questions. So we've arrived at a compromise, which is we show it on Facebook, and then we stop when it's your turn. So at this point, why don't you take questions?
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I have a comment. In about 1970, I was in a class on ethics and journalism, and your father was the provost at UNM at that point, and he came and lectured there, and this was before any book had been published.
You should use this.
Oh, anyway, it was before any book had been published. And I remember he said that he was going to retire, and I asked him what he was going to do in retirement, and as I said, it was before he had written it. Maybe he'd written, but he certainly had not published at this point. And he said, I'm going to try my hand at writing a mystery. I don't know if I can do it, but I'm going to try. So I thought that was appropriate to all of your comments here this evening. Anyway, thank you.
Sure. Here, right.
2 words. Janet Pete. Will she ever be revived?
The question was 2 words. Janet Pete. Will she ever be revived?
Yeah.
I thought she was a really interesting character.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I might try to figure out how to bring her back. Yeah. There was a young girl who was a runaway. I'm trying to remember what book that was. She was going to school in Santa Fe. You probably remember this, Barbara. And her grandfather was dying, so she runs away from school. Sosie, I think, was her name. Anyway, one reader said to me, I love that girl. You should bring her back. It would be great to see what she's like as a grown-up. And I think that was the one where then they go to Los Angeles.
I'm sorry, I don't remember.
I'm not remembering. Anyway, I'm not remembering it either, but I'm going to try to, because I can't remember the book, but I remembered that I liked that character. Really, I've inherited such a wealth of riches. I mean, I probably would not even have to invent any new characters. I could just sort of recycle Dad's.
Yeah.
But it's fun. It's fun to come up with my own books too.
All right, this is a really good moment to say, and I was inspired by that today. You think you've read all Tony Hillerman, and possibly you have read all Tony Hillerman. I have read all of Tony Hillerman, but by now it's time for me to reread all of Tony Hillerman, because talking to Janie today, I realized how much of it is just kind of blurred, And I would also recommend, because I still think it's just a fabulous book, if you never read his memoir called Seldom Disappointed, I can't recommend that enough, and that could even be a good place to begin, to start to, reread that. And then go all the way back to the Blessing Ray and read your way forward. They haven't dated, I mean, it's been a long time, but I think they're timeless.
Yes, ma'am.
You read your work so enthusiastically with such great expression. Have you ever considered doing the Audible version?
I was going to ask that.
So the question was, have I ever considered doing the Audible version of my books?
Yeah.
I haven't, because I'm finding that just kind of keeping the storylines going keeps me pretty darn busy. But I wouldn't mind doing it, you know. But basically, the publisher just finds somebody and farms that out.
Right.
They asked me what I thought of the young woman who reads them, and I said, well, I think she's okay. But then I asked some of my Navajo friends, and they said, well, she's okay, but she speaks Navajo with a Sioux accent. Yes.
Yeah, talking about bringing somebody back, you ever have a place in the book maybe for Cowboy Dashie?
Cowboy Dashie, you're going to bring him back?
Oh, Cowboy Dashie. Cowboy Dashie came back a little bit in Song of the Lion.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, he has a role there. I love that guy, so yeah. I don't tell my husband that, but yeah. And I like writing about that part of the reservation that adjoins the Hopi. So yeah, I would like to write about him again. Maybe develop his backstory a little bit too.
Anyone else?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever have the opportunity to meet your grandmother, Hillerman?
Yes. The question was, did I ever meet my grandmother, my dad's mom? I think she was probably close to 40 when my dad was born. So by the time me and my brothers and sisters came around, she was pretty elderly. But I met her several times, and she was a force to be reckoned with, I have to say. I could see how my dad, she was brilliant. She was really smart. I could see that part of my dad in her. But also she was pretty strict, and I think that might have been, she'd had a hard life, and I think that carried over to her. Yeah, she was not one of these grandmothers who would bake you cookies and have you sit on her lap.
Anyone else?
Yes.
When I read Fly on the Wall, it gave me a different view of your father and what, his being a reporter and also his ability to bring in detail. And it was interesting to see him in a different world, writing about a different world. So my questions are two. One, would you consider writing in a different genre than where you are right now? And number two, is there a book that you've written that really talks about who you are as a person, as a writer, and how you observe the world, which I felt was very true with Fly on the Wall. I really enjoyed that.
So this was a question in reference to my dad's second novel, which was not in the Jim Chi Joe Leapone series. It was a standalone called Fly on the Wall, which concerns scandal in a state highway department and a journalist who is investigating all of that. And her question was, and she said that she thought she learned a lot about my dad and his commitment to journalism, right? From reading that book. And so it was asking me would I consider writing in another genre, and would I write something like that? I guess yes is the answer. I feel like I'm loving writing mysteries, and I'm not ready to not do that anymore. But the more I do it, the more I'm kind of thinking that it would be fun to try something else. And I don't know about when I wrote Tony Hillerman's Landscape. My dad died before the book came out, so the publisher asked me to put in something more personal, and that was really, really hard. But it was satisfying at the same time. So I might write. I don't know what it would be, but sure. I mean, at this point, I'm open to all kinds of options. I just figure as long as I have the energy and enthusiasm for it, I'm just going to go for it.
Stick it in your cart.
Okay.
So what did your mother say to you when you gave her the book?
She said, I think your dad would be really proud of you.
Wow. Well, it seems to me that that's probably a great note to end this on.
for being here. I've never had to compete with the NCAA finals before, so I'm amazed to see so many folks here.
Timing is everything. We've come to